Once upon a time, in a remote village shrouded by ancient woods, there lived a young woman named Elara. Her beauty was unmatched, but her heart was cold. She craved admiration and thrived on the envy of others, reveling in their longing for what they could never have. One fateful evening, an old peddler arrived at the village square, his wagon brimming with trinkets and treasures. Among his wares was a peculiar mirror framed in blackened silver, etched with symbols that seemed to writhe under the moonlight. Its glass shimmered like still water, and its depths held an eerie allure. Alara's eyes fell on the mirror, and she demanded to possess it. The peddler hesitated, his gnarled hands clutching the mirror tightly. "This is no ordinary-looking glass," he warned. "It reveals not what you wish to see, but what you need to know. It shows regret, the kind that haunts your soul." Scoffing at his words, Elara tossed a bag of gold at his feet and seized the mirror. The old man's warnings echoed in her ears as she carried it home, but she dismissed them as the ramblings of a fool. That night, as the wind howled outside her cottage, Elara stood before the mirror. "Show me," she whispered, half expecting to see her radiant reflection. Instead, the surface darkened, and an image began to form, a child, crying in the cold. Elara recognized the girl as herself, abandoned by her mother in the woods. She saw her younger self's tears, the hunger in her eyes, and the moment when a passing nobleman took her in, raising her as his own. But the scene twisted. The nobleman, kind at first, grew harsh, demanding perfection. Elara watched herself rise to his expectations, becoming beautiful and cruel, pushing others away as she hardened her heart. She stumbled back, clutching her chest as pain bloomed within her. "This is nothing," she muttered. "The past is gone." Yet the mirror whispered to her, its voice soft and venomous. "Regret lingers, no matter how deep you bury it." Unable to resist its pull, Elara returned to the mirror night after night, watching fragments of her past. Each time, the glass showed moments she had long forgotten or chosen to ignore. Friendships broken by her pride, love lost to her vanity, kindness she had crushed beneath her ambition. Her beauty began to fade. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, and her once lustrous hair dulled. Yet she could not stop. The mirror had become her obsession, its visions a torment she could not escape. One night, as the storm raged louder than ever, the mirror revealed something new, her future. In its glass, she saw herself, old and alone, wandering through an empty house filled with shadows. She screamed and hurled the mirror to the ground, but it did not shatter. Instead, it whispered one final word. Too late. Elara couldn't sleep after the mirror's chilling revelation. The image of her decrepit, lonely self lingered in her mind, like a wound that wouldn't heal. She tried to convince herself it was just a trick, a cruel illusion conjured by the cursed glass. But deep down, she knew it was a glimpse of what awaited her. Days turned into weeks, and Elara grew more desperate. She avoided the mirror at first, draping it in a black cloth and shoving it into a corner. Yet she could feel its presence, as if it pulsed with a heartbeat. At night, she swore she heard whispers emanating from beneath the cloth, calling her name in a voice that was both her own and something else entirely. Her reflection began to betray her even in ordinary mirrors. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement when she stood still, a shadow in the background where there should have been none. But soon, her reflection refused to mimic her at all. It stared at her with accusing eyes, lips curling into a sneer of disdain. "You did this to yourself," it would hiss, its voice audible only to her. Terrified, Elara smashed every mirror in her home. Shards littered the floor, but even the fractured pieces seemed to mock her, their jagged edges glinting with malice. She locked herself inside, drawing the curtains and extinguishing every source of light. She thought darkness might offer her solace, but it only amplified her torment. One night, as the moon hung low and red in the sky, Elara awoke to the sound of shattering glass. She bolted upright, her breath hitching in her throat. The black cloth she had used to cover the cursed mirror was gone, and the mirror itself stood upright in the center of the room, its surface glowing faintly. Her legs trembled as she approached it, compelled by a force she couldn't resist. The glass rippled like water, and a new vision emerged, not of her past or future, but of something far worse. In the mirror, she saw a figure cloaked in shadows, its face hidden, but its presence unmistakable. It stood in a vast, barren wasteland, littered with broken mirrors. As the figure turned, Elara realized it was herself, but grotesquely transformed. Her skin was pallid, her eyes hollow and black, her lips stretched into a rictus grin. The reflection stepped closer, its bony fingers pressing against the inside of the glass as if trying to break through. "You cannot escape me," it whispered, its voice a chorus of agony. "We are one, bound by regret and the choices you've made." Elara screamed, stumbling back. The mirror's surface cracked, but instead of shattering, it oozed a dark, viscous liquid. The liquid pooled on the floor, forming tendrils that crept toward her. She ran, but the cottage seemed to twist and warp around her. The door was gone, the windows bricked over, the walls closed in, and the mirror's voice echoed in her mind. "Regret is a prison, and you have built it brick by brick." As the darkness enveloped her, Elara realized the truth. The mirror wasn't cursed. It was her conscience, her soul, reflecting everything she had refused to confront. Elara's screams faded into the oppressive silence of the mirror's prison. She awoke in a vast, featureless expanse. The air was heavy, filled with an acrid stench of decay. Shadows writhed around her, moving like living things, though no source of light illuminated the space. She looked down and saw her hands trembling. They were pale and withered, the veins prominent beneath her skin. Her reflection's words echoed in her mind. "We are one." A flicker of movement caught her attention. In the distance, shards of glass jutted from the ground, each one reflecting distorted versions of herself. Some were young and radiant, others old and decrepit, and still others monstrous, their faces twisted with malevolence. As she approached the nearest shard, the image within shifted. It showed her as a child, her face streaked with tears, clutching her knees as the nobleman shouted at her. "I only wanted to survive," she whispered. Her voice cracked, and her reflection sneered back at her. "You wanted more than survival," it spat. "You wanted power. You wanted control." The shard began to tremble, its surface rippling like water before it shattered, sending splinters flying. The pieces dissolved into black smoke that coiled around her, seeping into her skin. A wave of memories overwhelmed her. Every unkind word she had spoken, every betrayal she had orchestrated, every opportunity for kindness she had rejected. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground. The shadows around her grew thicker, forming a suffocating cocoon. From within, she heard voices, those of the people she had wronged. "You stole my chance at happiness," a woman's voice sobbed. "You destroyed my family's future," growled a man. "You left me to die," whimpered a child. Elara covered her ears, but the voices grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of blame and sorrow. "Stop!" she cried, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for any of this." The shadows receded, and the mirror appeared before her, hovering in midair. Its surface shimmered, and the grotesque reflection she had seen earlier returned. It stared at her with hollow eyes, its grin wider and more menacing than before. "Didn't mean for it?" it mocked. "You chose it. You fed your ambition with the suffering of others. Now their pain is yours to bear." The reflection stepped through the glass, its skeletal frame towering over her. It reached out, its bony fingers brushing against her cheek. Pain lanced through her body, and she screamed as the reflection began to merge with her. "No!" she shrieked, struggling against it, but her limbs felt heavy, as if weighed down by chains. Memories flooded her mind, each one sharper and more vivid than the last. She relived every regret, every misdeed, until she could no longer distinguish herself from the shadows of her past. When the process was complete, Elara opened her eyes. She was no longer in the void, but back in her cottage. The mirror stood before her, whole and pristine, its surface calm and still. She reached out to touch it, but her hand passed through the glass. Her reflection smiled, a cruel, victorious smile. Elara realized with dawning horror that she was now trapped inside the mirror, condemned to watch as her darker self walked free in the world, perpetuating the cycle of regret. Elara pressed her hands against the cold, unyielding surface of the mirror from within. Her prison stretched endlessly, an infinite void of reflections that all led back to her own face, haunted, pale, and twisted by despair. From her vantage point, she could see her dark reflection, the doppelgänger that now wore her face and lived her life. It moved through the world with a chilling grace, weaving deception and cruelty as if it were second nature. The people who once feared Elara now cowered before this even more sinister version of her, and she could do nothing but watch. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered into the silence. The void responded, its voice a blend of countless others, some hers, some not. "Because this is what you have become. The mirror merely reflects the truth of your soul." Desperation clawed at her mind. She had always believed she was in control, that her choices were necessary for survival in a cruel world. But now, stripped of excuses, she saw the weight of her actions for what they were: selfish, calculated, and devoid of compassion. Her prison was not static. Occasionally, the surface of the mirror rippled, and she glimpsed moments from the outside world. The doppelgänger was relentless, more ruthless than she had ever been. It sought out those she had wronged and deepened their suffering, mocking their pain with a smile that was eerily familiar. Elara screamed and pounded against the glass, but her efforts went unnoticed. Her voice was trapped within the void, a whisper lost in eternity. Then, one day, or what she assumed was a day, as time had no meaning in her prison, she saw something new. The doppelgänger had taken the mirror to the village square, where it placed the object on a pedestal for all to see. The villagers gathered, their faces filled with awe and fear. "Behold," the doppelgänger announced, its voice smooth and commanding, "a mirror that reveals the truth. Come, gaze upon your regrets, and find the strength to change or succumb to what you see." One by one, the villagers stepped forward. Some wept as the mirror showed them their failures and betrayals. Others screamed and fled, unwilling to confront their own darkness. But then, a young girl approached, a child no older than 10, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes shining with defiance. She stared into the mirror, unflinching, as it revealed her fears and regrets. Unlike the others, she did not turn away. "I can do better," the girl said, her voice trembling but resolute. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elara felt a flicker of hope. The child's words resonated within her prison, causing the void to tremble. The mirror's surface rippled, and for a moment, Elara thought she saw a crack form. The doppelgänger's smile faltered. It leaned closer to the child, its voice a venomous hiss. "You think you're stronger than the truth? Regret is eternal. It will consume you." But the girl did not falter. "Only if I let it." The crack in the mirror deepened, and Elara felt something stir within her, a spark of courage she thought she had lost long ago. She pressed her hands against the glass once more, this time with purpose. The doppelgänger whipped around, its hollow eyes locking onto her. "No!" it shrieked, its voice splintering into a cacophony of rage. "You cannot escape!" Elara pushed harder, the void around her collapsing into chaos. The mirror began to fracture, its surface splitting into jagged shards. With one final effort, she threw herself against the glass, shattering it completely. The world exploded into light. When the light subsided, Elara found herself lying on cold, damp earth. The air smelled of rain and soil, and the distant hum of life filled her ears. Chirping insects, rustling leaves, and the soft murmur of a breeze. She sat up, her head pounding, and realized she was no longer in the void. The shattered remains of the mirror surrounded her, glinting in the moonlight. Each shard still held fragments of reflections, faces twisted in sorrow, images of moments lost, and shadows of the regrets she had carried. But now they felt distant, like echoes of a storm that had passed. Elara's hands trembled as she touched her face. She felt warmth and flesh, not the cold, lifeless texture she had feared she would find. She was herself again, whole, but not unscarred. Her once perfect features were now marked by faint lines, her hair streaked with gray. She felt lighter, yet burdened by the memories that lingered. A sound behind her made her turn sharply. Standing in the clearing was the young girl from the village square, her wide eyes fixed on Elara with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "You broke it," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elara nodded, unsure how to respond. She opened her mouth to speak, but the girl took a step closer, her gaze shifting to the shards scattered around them. "The mirror showed me my mistakes," the child continued, "but it also showed me I could change. Did it do that for you too?" Elara hesitated. The mirror had shown her more than just her mistakes. It had revealed the darkness she had allowed to consume her, the pain she had inflicted on others, and the hollow existence she had created. It had trapped her in a prison of her own making, forcing her to confront every regret she had buried. "Yes," she finally said, her voice hoarse. "It showed me what I needed to see, even if it hurt." The girl knelt and picked up a shard, holding it carefully in her small hands. The fragment shimmered, revealing a fleeting image of the child crying over a broken doll. The girl smiled faintly. "I remember this. I was so upset, but my mother fixed it. She told me things can be mended if you try hard enough." Elara felt a lump rise in her throat. The child's words struck a chord deep within her, a truth she had ignored for so long. She knelt beside the girl and gently took the shard from her hands. "Not everything can be fixed," Elara said, her voice soft but firm. "But some things can, and for the rest, you can try to do better." As the words left her lips, the shard in her hand began to glow. The light spread to the other fragments, and one by one they dissolved into the air, leaving behind a faint warmth that seemed to seep into Elara's skin. The girl looked up at her, her expression hopeful. "Does that mean you'll try too?" Elara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll try." The girl smiled and turned to leave, disappearing into the forest. Elara watched her go, feeling a strange sense of peace. The mirror was gone, but its lessons remained. Elara knew the path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in her life, she was ready to walk it.